Well, hey, you guys, welcome back to the salon. So, if you'll remember, a very long time ago, the last time we were talking about Night Gallery, we talked about season 2, episode 13. So, obviously, on this episode, we're going to be talking about season 2, episode 14. Makes sense, right? So, this episode had 3 stories in it. Gonna say none of them are particularly memorable, although I will say the middle one is easily the best one, and it's actually pretty good, but the other 2 are just kind of eh. So the first story is called The Different Ones, and this one was written by Rod Serling and directed by John Meredith Lucas. He actually did loads of movies and TV, including 11 episodes of the original Star Trek, including like some really well-regarded episodes. Now this story, The Different Ones, is essentially, I feel, a less successful take on the classic 1959 Twilight Zone episode, which is called Eye of the Beholder. So the story is set at some point in the future where it seems like everybody has to conform to some arbitrarily normal, attractive appearance. And there are really no resources for people who are unlucky enough to, not look that great or like look different somehow. So there's a dad whose name is Paul Koch, and he's kind of lamenting the sad life of his 17-year-old son, whose name is Victor, whose face is initially hidden under like a black hood. But I mean, you're led to presume that he's like a real uggo, right? Like neighborhood kids come by the house specifically like to yell at Victor about what a freak he is, and his dad has to run them off like pretty much every day. Now, not surprisingly, Victor is pretty depressed about this whole situation, as you would be, because he knows that in this society, he'll never be able to hold down a job or get married or do any of the things that regular people do because of how he looks. So like on the down low, his dad, Paul, contacts some official, like over his fancy Jetsons video phone. It's like, ooh, we have those now. You know what I mean? And she tells him that there are really no institutions or agencies or anything like that to help with Victor's little ugliness problem. Now, Victor actually overhears this conversation and comes into the room and whips off his hood in front of the screen, like to show the official what he's dealing with. And gotta say, he's got like these really blackened eye sockets and these kind of waxy protuberances, like kind of dripping down his head. And I was like, he sort of looked a little bit like the lost member of Slipknot, except if you'd ordered him off of Wish. So Paul, the dad, later goes to visit like another official to ask her what the options are for his son. But she basically says to him, look, Victor can either live at home and have you, your dad, like take care of him and support him for his entire life, or he can be put to sleep as a mercy, because apparently that's a thing they do. Now, Paul naturally balks at euthanizing his son, who, other than his deformity, is very intelligent, very creative, he's a good guy. But honestly, it's really never quite explained why Paul can't just let Victor live with him as he has been up to now. You know what I mean? Maybe it's just because Victor is so unhappy and Paul feels bad, but there really doesn't seem to be any pressing reason why Victor can't just stay with his dad indefinitely, even though, he's 17, so he's kind of on the cusp of adulthood. But I kind of feel like, people that have disabilities and things like that, they live with their parents and their parents just take care of them, and that's just how it goes. So I don't really know. I don't remember if there was any kind of like big reason why his dad was like, oh, he has to get out of here, like he can't stay here for some reason. But I guess it was maybe just because he hated it there, like because he was depressed and getting made fun of all the time. I don't really know. So after he gets told this, like Paul is kind of dejected and he leaves the office. But as he's on his way out, like the official gets a phone call. And then she talks for a minute, and then she tells Paul to like wait up, like a new possibility might have just presented itself. So she says that Earth is doing an exchange with another planet called Boreon. Now, Boreon kind of has a low population and needs people, especially males. Now, the planet, unlike Earth, you're led to assume, has no laws governing the appearance of people who are sent there. So if Victor is willing to go, like he can actually be shipped off to another planet to see if he can perhaps live a relatively normal life there. So Victor seems willing to do that. He seems kind of ambivalent, though, about like leaving Earth and leaving his dad behind. But he does kind of say it's like, anywhere would be better than here. So, you kind of feel for the guy, right? And then after that, there's like a very, very long, clearly very padded out sequence of NASA stock footage of rockets launching and that kind of thing. Basically smacking the audience in the face for several minutes with the fact that Victor is most definitely going to another planet, you guys, in case that wasn't obvious from the dialogue. So when Victor arrives at the single Star Trek-looking corridor that comprises Boreon, low budget, you guys, he's actually greeted in passing, kind of, by a very conventionally handsome man who was leaving Boreon to go to Earth. Like, he was the one that was being exchanged for Victor. I guess that's how that works. So Victor asks him, it's like, well, why are you leaving? And the man says, oh, I just can't fit in on Boreon. And then he says something like, just look at me, like, I know what I look like. And then after the man leaves, a woman shows up to welcome Victor, and, surprise, surprise, she has the exact same facial deformity as Victor does, as do a gaggle of giggling women behind her who kind of are whispering among themselves like about how good looking Victor is. So obviously Victor is very happy about this and accompanies the women down the corridor, and he's like very pleased to fit in at last. So as I mentioned earlier, this is almost exactly the same plot as Eye of the Beholder, the Twilight Zone episode. In that episode, there was like an extremely attractive woman, and she keeps getting surgeries to look normal, but she keeps failing, even though you as the viewer are like, what are you talking about? She's beautiful. Like, why? She's like, oh, it messed up again. You know what I mean? But then, like, the twist of it is you find out at the end that she lives in a future where everybody looks like humanoid pigs, essentially. So it's like she wants to look like everyone else does. So because of that similarity, this episode didn't really hold any suspense. Like, once it was revealed that Victor was going to another planet, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion, like, as to what was going to happen, because it was pretty much the same twist. I mean, the acting in this one was actually really good, but, the melted candle looking makeup on Victor and the Boreonians, or whatever we call them, was kind of a little silly looking. And of course, like, the story wasn't really spooky or creepy at all. It was kind of more a morality tale about kind of judging people solely based on their looks and how, kind of people's looks are like arbitrary, you know what I mean? It's like you just want to fit in with everybody else and look like everybody else, like that kind of thing. So this one was kind of like so-so. It's like not great. And like I said, it's kind of predictable because it's so similar to Eye of the Beholder. Now, the second story is called Tell David. And this one, as I mentioned earlier again, was easily the best out of the three. Now, this one was directed by Jeff Corey from a teleplay by Gerald Sanford, and it was adapted from a short story by Penelope Wallace. So Sandra Dee is in this, and she plays a woman named Anne who's driving home from somewhere in a really bad thunderstorm, and she gets just hopelessly lost. So she spots a house, and she stops to ask for directions. So the woman who answers the door is very pleasant and very helpful, and her name is Pat Blessington, and she invites Anne inside to use the phone. Now, there are a couple of weird things going on in the house, though. Like, for one thing, the phone is some kind of futuristic pillar-looking thing with, like, a little screen on top, which Anne can hardly make heads or tails out of. She's like, what the fuck is this thing? And, like, Pat is just kind of like, yeah, just use the phone. And she's just like, is this a phone? What is this? You know what I mean? She eventually, like, figures out how to call home to tell her husband that she's going to be late because she got lost, but the line at her house is busy and she can't get through. The house also has some real high-tech, like, closed-circuit security system that looks kind of like a Willy Wonka kind of thing, and sort of snazzy one-way glass on the windows, that kind of shit. And then when Anne asks Pat if she has a cigarette, Pat says, well, I don't smoke, but we should have a pack around here somewhere because my husband, David, always keeps things like that around for guests because he likes being like a good host or whatever. So she finds a pack, and the cigarettes are a brand that Anne has never heard of, and they have no tar and no nicotine. So Anne smokes one, and she thinks it's great. She's like, wow, so refreshing. I never had one of these before. But Pat kind of seems a little bit confused because she didn't know that there were any other cigarette brands other than that one. And soon enough, David, the husband, comes downstairs. Now, Pat told Anne that David was really into gadgets and like inventing things, hence all the cool shit in their house, or so you're led to assume. To help Anne find her way home, he produces what is essentially a GPS, but kind of housed in something like the size of a briefcase. Like it's this big, huge thing, but it's pretty much like a map, like a Google Maps thing. And he shows her like the best route to take on it. So Anna's like obviously super grateful for the couple's help. And then they ask her to come by and visit them again in a few days. And she says she'd be happy to because they're really lovely. You know what I mean? And then she drives off toward home. Strangely, though, when she gets home and pulls into the driveway, everything is dry. Like there's no sign of this raging thunderstorm that she drove through, in other words. So she kind of shrugs and she's like, whatever. Maybe it was just like a cloud burst or it's just one of those little bitty. I mean, I live in Florida. That's really not that weird. It could be raining in the front yard and it's not raining in the backyard. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's kind of that kind of thing. So she's just like, yeah, whatevs. And then after that, there's a very weird sequence where she walks into the house, into the living room. And then there's like a figure in a cape and like a Halloween mask, kind of like an old man or an old lady witch mask or something. And he's behind her, like up against the wall. And he jumps out and grabs her. She's kind of startled, but not really that startled. And then she immediately realized, oh, this is her husband, Tony, wearing a bizarre costume for reasons which are never really explained. Is this a kink they have? I'm not really sure. So he screeches in like a voice that is not his, about her being late and why didn't she call and was she with someone else and all this other kind of shit. Like he's just acting like really, really bizarre. And then Anne asks him, is that what I sound like? So you're led to assume that this is a fight they have a lot. Like when Tony doesn't let her know where he is, you're led to assume that she's like, hey, where were you? Were you with someone else? Blah, blah, blah. So he's very like defensive and insists that Anne is too jealous. And apparently he's trying to get back at her by using her own words against her, it seems. But, dressing up in like a withered old crone costume to make that point seems a little bit deranged, I'm going to say. So Anne tells him that she got lost in the storm and that she stopped at a house for directions and that she did call home, but the line was busy. Now, Tony dismisses this, saying no one was using the phone all evening. And then Anne says, well, maybe their nanny, Yvonne, was on the phone. And then after that, there follows a very significant glance between Yvonne and Tony that all but advertises in bright neon letters the fact that the two of them are boinking behind Anne's back. So, in other words, Anne has every right to be suspicious because Tony is in fact cheating on her, but he's kind of gaslighting her into thinking that she's just imagining it all because she's jealous. So, cool. So anyway, a few days later, Anne goes back to visit the Blessingtons, as she said she would. Now, there's another young woman there who it looks like is getting David to fix some gadget for her, because like I said, he's real into gadgets and stuff. And before this woman leaves, she full on kisses David right on the mouth, like right in front of his wife. And his wife like doesn't react at all, other than just with like placid indifference, right? I will admit that at this point in the story, even though this episode aired in 1971, I thought that Pat and David were going to turn out to be like swingers and we're going to ask Anne to join them like as a third, because that's totally the vibe I got from this whole situation. But that isn't what happens. I mean, not going to lie, that would have been kind of hot, but that's not what happens. What actually happens is that after the young woman leaves who kissed David, Anne asks Pat, it's like, how come you don't get jealous seeing your husband kissing another woman in front of your face? So both David and Pat just kind of shrug like it's no thing. And David says, oh, jealousy is a very destructive emotion and you can't let it control your life and blah, blah, blah. So I'm like, so we should just let our husbands make out with other chicks in front of us and not say boo about it? I mean, I guess that's the message I'm getting there. I mean, dude's got a dude, don't you know? So David then tells Anne a story about why he doesn't get jealous. When he was 4, he says, he tried to slice a piece of cake at his birthday party, but he cut his thumb with a knife, and he still has a scar from it because he shows his thumb and it has a scar on it. He says that on that same day, his birthday, his 4th birthday, his dad wasn't at the party for possibly suspect reasons. His mom got jealous, thinking he was seeing another woman, and the long and short of it was that his mom ended up killing his dad and then herself. So young David was then sent to live with distant relatives whose last name was Blessington. So David says to her, jealousy killed my mom. And he's like, but still, I forgave her. And he still has this really cherished picture of her that she left for him, like before she killed herself. She's very beautiful, David says, and looks very meaningfully at Anne. Now, at this point, astute viewers will very likely have deduced that David is actually Anne's son, but 20 years in the future. So that explains why there's all these like futuristic Jetsons-y gizmos in the Blessingtons' house. But also, Anne mentioned earlier that she had a 4-year-old son whose name was also David. And in case you didn't notice, David and Anne's husband, Tony, are played by the same actor to make sure that there's like a family resemblance. Like, interestingly, Anne never comments on this. Like, the hair is different. They look a little bit different, but it's clearly the same dude. So once that realization hits, you can kind of see how the rest of the episode is probably going to play out. So Anne gets home. She's having a little birthday party for her son, David, who is 4. And her husband, Tony, is MIA, evidently visiting his cousin, Jane, or so he says. And little David indeed cuts his thumb while trying to slice the cake. Now she's convinced that she has met David 20 years in the future through she went through some weird time loop or something like that. And when Tony gets home, she attempts to tell him the whole thing about, he said that I killed you and then I killed myself and I don't want that to happen and blah, blah, blah. But of course, he doesn't believe her and thinks that she's losing her marbles. So she's kind of like confined to bed. She's very anxious. She's kind of ranting a little bit. But then she remembers the cigarette pack that she got from Pat the first day that she showed up at future David's house. Now, the pack has made in 1989 printed on it. Because like I said, it's obviously not the future now. That's like when I was still in high school. That was a long time ago. But it's like, this episode came out in 1971. So 1989 was the future. You know what I mean? So she's like, ooh, she's all excited. She's like, she goes to take the pack downstairs to show Tony that she's telling the truth. She's like, look, these are from the future. Now, of course, when she gets downstairs, she sees Tony canoodling with the nanny, Yvonne, as we knew that was going on. And in a fit of rage, she shoots him dead. I mean, he kind of had it coming. You know what I'm saying? So she gets arrested and put in jail. And when her lawyer comes to talk about her defense, she very serenely says, oh, there's not going to be a trial, implying that she's going to off herself, thus succumbing to the fate that her future son warned her about. So she's kind of comforted by the fact that future David told her that he had forgiven her and he still had her picture and had a good life and also a wife who loved him and let him mac on other women without complaining. So, and by the way, little David, after she kills the husband, he's sent to live with Jane Blessington, who it turns out was Tony's cousin after all. So that part, yeah, she was wrong to be jealous about that because that actually was a relative, but he was totally still banging the nanny. So yeah, this was actually a pretty great little story. It wasn't scary at all, obviously, but it was like really intriguing. It had really solid acting performances, particularly from Sandra Dee, who I think was like terrific in this. And it had like a really cool, like twisty plot. There were a couple of strange things in regards to Tony's kind of baffling stunt with the Halloween costume, which, like I said, was not really explained. And the sort of underlying message that you shouldn't be jealous or suspicious of your husband, even though he is 100% cheating on you. But this was just an entertaining story all around. And I think this was really the highlight of the episode. So the third story, Lagoda's Heads, was sort of dumb and also kind of racist. And so, obviously, because of those reasons, it was by far the weakest of the bunch. Even though the teleplay was written by none other than Robert Bloch, author of Psycho, if you didn't know, and based on a story by August Derleth. The guy that directed a lot of these episodes, Gino Swark, I know I always pronounce it wrong, but he's the one that directed this one as well. So there's a guy named Major Crosby and a dude named Henley, and they show up in some unnamed African village. And they're kind of like your stock monkey and tropical bird noises on the audio track. I was kind of like, oh my God, thank fuck there were no added Ooga Booga tribal chants in there. Although, to be honest, it wouldn't have surprised me if there had been. It's that kind of episode, you know what I mean? So Henley is looking for his brother, who is an anthropologist, and he might have come this way. And after some kind of rigmarole with this wildly gesticulating old woman, who's actually played by Zara Cully from The Jeffersons, they're allowed into a hut to consult the village elder, I guess he is, who is the titular Lagoda. Now, Lagoda says that no white men have come around here and that he has no idea where Henley's brother might have got off to. Because he seems kind of sketchy, Henley does not believe him and kind of starts to mouth off about the situation. But he gets interrupted by the entrance into the hut of the beautiful Kiro, who's actually played by Denise Nicholas of Blackula fame. Because I was like, hey, she was in Blackula. You know what I mean? That's a great movie, by the way. But yeah, she says she's from another village, and she tells Henley that his brother is dead. Now, Lagoda tells her to shut her trap or he's going to put a curse on her. And then he invites the men, the white dudes, to come into the next room so he can ask his heads what happened to Henley's brother. So Lagoda kind of starts shimmying around, presumably getting psychic information from the series of actually pretty decent looking shrunken heads that he has kind of tied to this horizontal pole. So the heads kind of sway back and forth by themselves as though some mysterious wind is blowing them or something. And then at the end of it, Lagoda kind of decrees that Henley's brother has drowned in a river. Too bad, so sad. So the Great White Hunters are not so sure they buy this, but it appears that Lagoda has given his last word on the subject. So Kira asks the white dudes if she can come back to their camp with them and if they can station a guard on her, like to protect her from Lagoda. So they're like, sure, why not? Like, come along. The next day, however, Kiro is unscathed. But a messenger comes from Lagoda's place and says that Lagoda has actually been murdered. So Crosby, Henley, and Kiro all rush to Lagoda's hut, and Crosby steps into the room where the shrunken heads are, and then he comes out with this just look of utter shock and revulsion on his face. Lagoda is completely torn apart, he says, and then he wonders if maybe some wild animals might have got to him. And twist, Kiro then very smugly informs them that it wasn't animals that killed Lagoda, but it was her own stronger magic. She basically says Lagoda could talk to the heads, like they gave him psychic information, but she knew how to make them kill. So the camera then kind of does a close-up on what appears to be like blood and maybe some chunks of flesh in the mouth of one of the shrunken heads. And after that revelation, I'm sitting there left with the perhaps unintentionally hilarious visual of a grown-ass man being torn limb from limb by a dozen teensy little shrunken heads whose eyes are sewn shut and who don't have any arms and legs. So I'm like, can they hover? What's that? You know, like around the body? Like, that's what I was thinking. I was like, wait, couldn't Lagoda just have stomped on them? Like, I have so many questions. So yeah, this one was a little bit cringe, if I'm being honest with you. Two of the actors, like Patrick McNee and Brock Peters, the guy that played Lagoda, they're really good in their roles, but the rest of the actors kind of don't come off so well. And I don't really think it's their fault. I think it's the material. The whole story just feels like a huge misfire. It kind of like succumbs to every tribal African magic cliche in the book. And while I felt that it wasn't like overtly racist, it's like pretty uncomfortable to watch, like regardless. Like I get that the original August Derleth story was from the 30s or maybe the 40s, but it seems like, you know, they still could have made some changes to be more contemporary with the times and maybe not fall prey to the stereotypes that they fell into. So like not a complete failure, but definitely one of the worst installments of the series, unfortunately. So that will wrap up season 2, episode 14. So, you know, keep watching this space for whenever I eventually put up a thing of the next one, which will be 15, obviously, because I know you guys can all count. So yeah, thank you very much for stopping by the salon today. Remember, like, share, subscribe, and comment if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.